Welcome to Step by Step, the podcast where I break it all down. Life, drama, gossip, and everything in between. I'm your host, Taya, and this is my audio journal, filled with stories, reflections, and the kind of tea you won't find anywhere else. Each episode, we'll take it step by step, starting with Monday mindfulness to kickstart your week, diving into the magic of Wednesdays with our main episode, and wrapping up with Your Say Friday, where your stories, questions, and even a little anonymous gossip take center stage. This isn't just my podcast, it's ours. So grab your headphones and take this journey with me, one step at a time. This episode discusses topics including violence, war, cancer, car accidents, and fertility struggles. If these subjects are sensitive for you, please listen with care or skip this episode if needed. Your well-being comes first. Hello everyone and welcome back. This episode is a little different. People have said that they want to hear about me, my experiences, and my stories. So I've listened and delivered. For that reason, I will start with why this podcast exists. I decided to take a leap and start a podcast. A space where I can have an audio journal, if you will. Instead of writing, I can talk, I can process my thoughts in real time and learn as I go. They say you understand yourself better when you say things out loud. That's when light bulb moments happen. And if this helps me grow or even just reaches one person who connects with what I'm saying, then that's enough for me. Another big reason, one day when my baby Luna is older and needs advice, she can listen back and hopefully find wisdom or comfort in my words. Luna and any other kids I might have. Plus, this is something I can do from home without mess. It's a creative outlet and I need that. I'm a creative person and I constantly need to be making something. But with a little one, finding time for creativity can be tricky and limited. So I just jumped in. No overthinking, no waiting for the perfect time, just doing it. It's always nice to try something new too. And funny enough, early last year, someone who reads numerology told me that I'd be starting a podcast. Then a year later, a psychic told me the same thing. So here I am aligning with my future. Ultimately, I've just surrendered to the process. I'm just doing it with no expectations and for the right reasons. I'm trusting the process and the universe and seeing where this is going to take me. Whether it leads to something bigger and better down the line or simply just remains a passion project, I'm okay with either outcome. So you want to know me and my story. To truly understand me, you need to know my family history and culture. Because ultimately, that shapes me, my beliefs, and who I am today. So let's start from the beginning. Back in the 1800s, during the Turkish rule, my great-great-grandfather and his brothers lived in Montenegro. One of them killed a Turkish man, maybe stabbed him, and when the Turks came after them, they knew what was coming. Back then, execution wasn't quick, it was brutal. The Turks had a method where they would impale you on a stake through your butt and keep you alive for as long as possible, displaying you on the streets as a warning and showing your shame. The longer you survived, the more skilled your executioner was considered. If you've seen Game of Thrones, you get the idea. So they ran. They were hunted, and if they were caught, they knew what their fate would be. One brother escaped to Switzerland, Zurich, changed his name, and became Serbian. Another fled to Turkey, and the rest, our direct ancestors, settled in Bosnia. To this day, there's an entire village in Turkey made up of people from Bosnia. The Karajcics and Kovačevićes spread everywhere. Karajcics is from my grandpa's side and Kovačevićes are from my grandma's side, by the way. Fast forward to World War II, my grandma's uncle, her father and aunt were captured and sent to Auschwitz. Her aunt had a number tattooed on her arm, either a 6 or a 9. No names were used, just numbers. My grandma's father was luckier. Instead of getting sent to camps, he was forced to work on a German estate. It was still hard, but it was better than the fate of Auschwitz. Her uncle wasn't as fortunate. He tried to escape once and made it to a village, but he was caught by the Ustasha and taken back. He never returned. After the war, though, word came from Sydney that he had survived. He had made it to Australia and promised that one day, when he would come back. A lot of Karajcics ended up in Sydney. The Karajcic family were simple, hard-working people, farmers, landowners, self-sufficient and honest. The Karajcics, a completely different story. They were musicians, creatives, social people who spent their time in cafes, craftsmen, more free-spirited, gypsies if you will. Work was not exactly their thing. When my grandma was around 12, her mother died suddenly from kidney failure. They were just kids living in the village, left to fend for themselves. My grandma has 3 sisters. The youngest went to Croatia, the eldest went to Serbia, and the second youngest went to live on a farm in Bosnia. The second youngest sister, Baba Mica, died many years ago now, when I was about 14. The rest of them still live, her older sister being one of the oldest Karajcics to live. My grandma's father had a sister, a lovely woman who had a tough life. Her husband was an alcoholic and she had 2 sons. She struggled, but she was strong. She has lived the longest out of everyone. So let's carry on a bit further. My family were born and raised in a place now called ex-Yugoslavia. Perhaps some of you have heard about it, a lot of you maybe not. Life there was simple, equal and easy as described by my family. There was no stark division between high class and low class. Everyone was looked after. Education was free. Healthcare was free. Housing was free. Yugoslavia was positioned between the Western world and the Eastern way of living. It was a unique blend of cultures where Western music played on the radio, yet traditions were deeply rooted in everyday life. While Tito was alive, life was good. Religion wasn't a major influence. People could practice their faith, but majority didn't. There was harmony and unity among different ethnic groups, and everyone considered themselves Yugoslavs before anything else. But after Tito died, everything changed. The new government introduced democracy, but it was a corrupt and unstable version of it. Nationalism began to rise and the unity of Yugoslavia began to unravel. Slovenia was the first to separate, heavily influenced by the Western world and political ties with America. After Slovenia, Croatia saw independence. When Bosnia attempted to do the same, the situation became complex. Unlike Slovenia and Croatia, Bosnia was a mix of Serbs, Orthodox Christian, Bosniaks, Muslims, and Croats, Catholics. Religion became the excuse for division, but in reality, politics and power were the real motivators. People believed that war could never happen in Bosnia. They had lived together in harmony for decades, but warning signs were there. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. My mother was a school teacher, and she took her students on a 2-week camping trip to Dubrovnik as they did every year. But this time, they had to return early. The city was being bombed. That was about 6 months before the Bosnian War officially started. Soon after returning to Sarajevo, a major event occurred. Someone was killed at a wedding. A Serbian killed a Bosniak, or the other way around. That was the trigger. The city was barricaded, and movement became impossible. My uncle, realizing what was coming, left the country while the borders were still open. But my mother became trapped, and so did the rest of my family. I asked the same thing. Why didn't they leave with my uncle? Because most people didn't believe that war could happen in Bosnia. Everyone lived in harmony for a very long time. Nobody really took it seriously. I mean, if someone told you that war might start, you probably wouldn't take it too seriously too. However, of course some did, like my uncle. So the war had begun. The city was bombed relentlessly. There were grenades from the hills and sniper fire from buildings. There was no food, no electricity, no water. Curfews were enforced. But even during the day, movement was dangerous and people chose not to leave. People adapted in whatever ways they could. The army groups began raiding homes and doing what they wanted. My family, not being very religious, were treated with suspicion and always under supervision. For the first 4 to 5 months, my mother lived in a basement in a very tall apartment building. She started a small school in that basement for children in her building, trying to give them a sense of normalcy. Roughly 8 months into the war, humanitarian organizations were finally allowed into the city. Schools and universities tried to function to some capacity. People would need to walk to work, not because there was work to do, but to check in and prove that they were still alive. It was about holding on to some kind of hope that life would resume when the war ended. Refugees filled the schools, people who no longer had homes because they were bombed, burnt, or taken over. They had to sleep somewhere, so they were sleeping wherever they could. Public transport no longer worked, so walking was the only option. After a while, coffee shops started opening again. There were small pockets of social life amidst the destruction. People adapted to survive. They collected water from natural springs or turned umbrellas upside down to catch rain. When the snow would fall, you would do the same. Sugar and canned food became currency. Cigarettes were worth their weight in gold. 1 kilogram of sugar could get you a bicycle. 10 kilograms of bombed flour was about $35, while not bombed flour was $50. Makeshift candles were made from shoe wax and any flammable fat. All the trees in the city were cut down for firewood. Anything you could burn was used for cooking and candles. Things like tires and shoes. Windows were destroyed within the first few weeks, so plastic sheets covered them. People in high-rise buildings had to walk up to 14 to 20 flights of stairs carrying supplies, my family included. What's absurd is people who once lived together in peace now hated each other. My family's story is just one of many, but it reflects the deeper truth of what happened. People of different religions once lived together in peace and unity until hate and discrimination tore them apart, but for what? Religion was just an excuse. At its core was politics and money. Mainly American and Russian interests, the power struggle between the East and the West. The Arab and Turkish Muslim world claimed that they were protecting Bosnian Muslims, but in reality they were just causing more destruction and killing even more people. When the war broke out, my family was in the Muslim part of Sarajevo, Bosnia. No one in my family was particularly religious, yet where they lived and even their names determined how they were seen. My grandpa had a Muslim name, so people assumed that he was Muslim. My grandma had an Orthodox name, and they were married. Should they kill each other now? My grandma's sister was married to a Croatian Catholic and grew up in Croatia, so she was considered to be Croatian. In Bosnia, she was labelled as Croatian, but when she moved to Croatia, they treated her as Serbian because they knew that she wasn't Catholic. She was Croatian in Bosnia, but Serbian in Croatia. My grandma's elder sister lived in Serbia, and the younger sister was a Bosnian Serb. Did that mean that they were supposed to be enemies and kill each other, their own family, brothers against brothers, sisters against sisters? The logic of the war made no sense. My grandpa was a good person, and so was my grandma. They celebrated and respected all religions, and they still do today, because it was never about division, it was about unity. Even in the middle of the war, some people refused to let hatred win, but that's what was happening, all at the cost of humanity. So I'm going to share some stories and experiences. My grandmother once waited in a long line for water only to be kicked out because she was recognized and labeled as Orthodox. There was another time that she smiled on a bus later on when they had them every now and then, and the bus driver threw her off because she smiled, forcing her to walk miles to check in at work. One night, 3 armed men came to my mother's door accusing her of speaking to a Serbian Chetnik over the phone from a medical university. In reality, she was talking to her own mother. They demanded that my mum goes with them and took her for questioning. The leader of the military recognized her, Yuka. He lived as their neighbor before the war and had been a childhood friend of my uncle's. That recognition likely saved her life. They had a chat about how my uncle was and they sent her home. Many people were taken that night, and those who were taken disappeared forever. My mum cut her hair one time, and when people saw how good she was at it, everyone came to her. She was cutting hair in the hallway outside the apartment. One day, a soldier in uniform with bombs attached to it came for a haircut. While she was cutting hair, bombs were falling around the apartment. She wanted to flee to the basement, but he wouldn't let her go. He was so unhappy with the haircut and demanded that she fix it. In her head, she wished him not to carry the haircut around for long. A few days later, she heard that he had been killed. On another occasion, my mum and my auntie were supposed to go somewhere with grandma and her 2 friends. I don't remember where they were going, maybe to fetch some water or to check into work. But at the last minute, my mum and my auntie had a weird feeling and they decided to turn back. Something was telling them not to go. Maybe the grenades that started up again. My grandma and her 2 friends continued on. My grandma has always been watched over by her grandfather spiritually, and what happened next only proved it. Not long after my mum and the others left, a bomb dropped right where they would have been. My grandma stood in the middle with her two friends on either side. Completely untouched, my grandma was, while the other two got hurt, one maybe even lost a limb. But that wasn't the only time something like this happened. There have been many times when my grandma had been left untouched. There are many other stories of terror, but sometimes we don't need all the details. Perhaps I can make a sequel if there's interest. So after 2.5 years in the war, my mother found a way out. The only way to leave was to have a valid medical reason, so she managed to obtain a medical permit. She waited 12 hours to pass through the Sarajevo Tunnel, a hidden passage beneath the airport used to transport supplies, injured civilians, and those lucky enough to escape. From there, she climbed hills and mountains to reach a bus. This bus was en route to Croatia. She had a permit for Germany, but not for Croatia, so she had to exit the bus before the Croatian border. Family friends met her just before the border and smuggled her into Croatia, where she stayed at their house illegally near Split. She couldn't get out. The only way forward was through illegal smuggling. The options were grim. One possibility was hiding inside a shipping container, but she refused. Many people didn't make it out of there alive. Instead, she found human traffickers who could drive her in a van across borders. She didn't know the route, the countries she passed through, or the risks ahead, but that was the better option. So she went to Zagreb to the family friend's son's place. Her brother, my uncle, sent her the papers to Germany, and he was in Switzerland. He paid the smugglers for her. My mum describes this journey as a blur. The only thing she remembers from that journey is a moment at a border crossing. A guard stopped the van, but the driver of the van got out and sorted out the situation. However he did, we will never know. But she made it. She arrived to Germany. In Haldiram, Germany, she met with my uncle and his wife. She stayed there for a few nights. My uncle's wife was 9 months pregnant with my cousin Tina. They had to cross the German border to get into Switzerland, where my uncle and auntie lived at the time. So my auntie and mum walked through the forest at night for 3 hours. My uncle met them at the border and waited. After making it through the forest and across the border, my mum spent a few days resting in Lausanne, a city in Switzerland, with my family before she turned herself into the Swiss embassy as a refugee. When she turned herself in, they placed her in a refugee camp in Chiasso, which initially felt like jail. They were there like caged animals and only allowed 1 hour a day of rec. She stayed there for about a month or so. That camp was where every refugee with no status arrived. Authorities would constantly interview people to determine if they were genuinely seeking refuge or faking it. They had to decide whether to allow them to stay in Switzerland or to send them somewhere else. After a month, they sent my mum to Aarau, a town in the German-speaking canton of Switzerland, for 3 days. There she met a woman named Amina, also from Bosnia, who escaped too. Together they were transferred to a single women's refugee house in Zofingen, Switzerland. The Swiss government granted my mum a visa to stay in Switzerland until the war was over. The house she lived in was full of women from all over the world: Somalia, Pakistan, Bosnia, Serbia, Turkey. They were just some. There were many more places that these women came from. When she first arrived, she was placed in a house with 25 to 30 other women. The room she was in had about 8 sets of army bunk beds, meaning she shared a space with 15 other people. She was the 16th. The longer you stayed in this house, sometimes people would leave, so the better your chances of moving into a smaller room upstairs and upgrading was. Upstairs, you would only have to share a room with 3 other people. My mum eventually moved to one of those smaller rooms after about a year of being there. In total, she probably lived there for about a year and a half. At first, when she got to this place, the other women bullied her. They didn't like her, and she didn't like them. She cried constantly and wondered how she would survive living there. They even put rotten apples in her clothes, making her life miserable. But over time, they all became friends, bonding through dance. She realized that she has no choice but to stop crying and start dancing with them, and that's when everything changed. Once she befriended these women in the house, they began sharing things with her instead of tormenting her. Each woman in the house received 91 francs per week, but only if they stayed in the house. So my mum would use her money to buy a carton of cigarettes for 47 francs, 25 francs calling her parents, and whatever was left would go to food. She lived mostly on fruit yogurts because that's all she could afford. Technically, she and the others were free to leave the house whenever they wanted, but locals didn't like the refugees, so they rarely ventured outside. This is where I come into play. One day, my dad came to the refugee house to visit a woman. The woman had recently divorced and was casually dating multiple men, my dad included. This woman my mum, my dad, and a few other women went for coffee one day. After the outing, my mum asked the woman if she could see my dad again, and she told her go for it, she didn't care. So my mum went out with him again, and then once again after that. And on one of those outings, the last one, in a hotel, I was conceived. At that point, my mum realised that if she stayed in the house, everyone would figure out that she was pregnant. She didn't want gossip, and she didn't want to tell anyone who the father was. She definitely didn't want my dad to know. His story is a whole other topic and episode. If you want to hear about it, let me know. But for now, I'm just going to keep this one-sided. So my mum ran. She went to Lausanne. She ended up staying with my auntie's brother, his mum, and his grandma. In that house, there was also a man called Stevo, a thief from Zenica, who shared a room with my auntie's brother and my mum. They rotated between sleeping on the couch, floor, and bed every night. Stevo gave my mum a gold Zippo lighter and a jumper as a parting gift before he eventually passed away later down the track. Because my mum had left the women's refugee house, she no longer received her weekly francs. She was broke. She had no money for food and no way to support herself. Meanwhile, my grandparents managed to escape Bosnia and made it to Switzerland as refugees as well. My grandparents have their own story, of course. So to put it shortly, in the early days of the war, they lived in Adaptation, a neighborhood in Sarajevo with my mum. They had this apartment for 15 years after the war, and they lived on the 14th story. As I mentioned before, my uncle had left as the war started, but he used to live there too. When the war first started, my grandpa had tried to convince my mum to go to Belgrade to stay with her auntie Emira. My grandma, however, begged my mum not to go, so my mum decided to visit her other auntie, Baba Lila, which is my grandma's younger sister, on the other side of the city in a neighborhood called Bjelove, to say goodbye and regroup from there. My mum planned to leave the next day to Auntie Emira's house while trains were still running. That night, peace protests were happening though in the city, so her auntie Lila suggested waiting to see if the situation would calm down. But the next morning, that's when war broke out full force. The borders closed, bombs started falling, and my mum was trapped. She wasn't able to turn home because of the grenades falling everywhere and snipers, so she stayed with her auntie Lilia and her family in the basement on the other side of the city for a long time. Grandma and Grandpa came every week or so to see my mum because they had to check into school anyway, so they risked their life to see her. The school was nearby my grandma's sister's house, and so was my mum's school. That's where they had to check in. I don't know if I mentioned, but they were all teachers. Grandma and Grandpa couldn't escape the war or get papers to leave until after 5 years, when you could leave to see family. So in 1994, they asked to see my grandpa's mum. They took and made passports before they left to try and escape when they can. Baba Lila, my grandma's sister, and Gordan, her husband, that my mum lived with at the first part of the war, they managed to escape and leave not long before my grandparents through having connections with the army. Now they live and have lived ever since in Karbuni on Korčula, which is a place in Croatia. When they exited, my grandpa said, "We won't wait any longer. We don't have anything left in Bosnia but for them to kill us." He said, "The first chance we get, we will leave." At this point, all the family was in Switzerland except for Gordan and Nida. They were in Croatia where it calmed down a little bit. And also my grandma's other sisters were not there. So it was October 1995 when they got the chance to escape. My grandma had had a surgery, so she used that as an excuse to get a medical certificate, as my mum did, stating that she was unfit for work. This was crucial because it allowed her to apply for a passport. The same family friends that helped my mum out from Split helped my grandparents out too. They sent over papers to Bosnia saying that there was something wrong, a defect league, which is a term that was used during former Yugoslavia to refer to a list or a register of people who are considered unfit to work, often due to health reasons. It was a way of categorizing individuals who were considered to have disabilities or other conditions that made them unable to perform regular employment. The system was sometimes used to help people access certain benefits or permits, such as the ability to travel or exit the country by providing documentation that the person was medically unfit to work, which helped my grandparents create the opportunity to get their visas and leave. They first travelled to Croatia the same way my mum did, where they stayed in Split using their visas and papers with these family friends that my mum was with too. From there, they would take a boat to Korčula, where they stayed a few days with my grandma's sister, Baba Lila, who had already escaped at that point. That's the one that I mentioned earlier. Afterward, they'd return to Split and from there catch another boat to Italy. The neighbour of those friends in Split took them on the boat. He helped them cross the sea to Ancona, Italy. When they were on the boat to Italy, they were questioned by authority who stopped to speak with them. They noticed everyone else seemed to be going on a shopping trip, so my grandma said the same thing. When asked where they were headed, they replied, "Italy for shopping." The man raised an eyebrow, seeing that they had bags with them and an accordion that my grandfather dragged through the tunnel. So they just came out and said, "We're running away to Switzerland." Had they said they were staying in Italy, they wouldn't have been allowed to pass, but they said Switzerland, and that was enough for them to continue their journey. From there, they took a taxi to Milan, then transferred to a smaller train that would take them to Lugano in Switzerland. But they couldn't pass the border just yet. A young man from Switzerland, someone my uncle knew, was the one who made it possible thanks to my uncle organising it. However, he couldn't take them directly over the bridge to cross the border because of the legalities, but he arranged for their stuff to be carried across and told them to cross the bridge casually, just like as if they were walking and talking normally. He said, "If they catch you, I'll wait for you, but if you make it past the 100-meter mark, you'll meet up with Sasha," my uncle, and his friend Mirsha. So they walked slowly over the bridge. The border control was nearby, and they could see and feel the tension rising. At first there were cars going over and people, so it was easy to disguise, but out of nowhere there was no one. My grandma whispered, "What if they catch us?" My grandpa just replied, "Shh, keep going." Then a group of teenagers, about 15 or 16 years old, came running through, and my grandparents joined the group to blend in. They were unnoticed as they walked through, passing the border control. After they crossed, lo and behold, my uncle, Sasha, was waiting. He cried because he hadn't seen his parents in so long and didn't know if they would make it out alive. But they couldn't stop to say hello, they had to keep going. At one point, as they crossed the bridge, Sasha, my uncle, called Nermin, the man with the belongings, to let them know that they passed safely, and he took the belongings in a different direction to avoid drawing attention to the fact that someone had just crossed. In our culture, the first haircut you get as a baby is done by your godmother. In this case, my godmother, or the one who cut my fringe, helped and hosted my grandparents. My grandparents had to go through interviews in Switzerland too, in places like Lausanne, Geneva, Basel, and Lucerne. The lady asking the questions reviewed the footage and they saw themselves recorded entering the country. They entered so easily, but getting out of Bosnia had been incredibly difficult. From Sarajevo, my grandparents had all the necessary papers and exited through the tunnel. The tunnel wasn't as touristy as we see today. It was a dangerous, rundown and dirty passage. Through it all, my grandfather carried a harmonica, which is a piano accordion. If you've ever seen one, it's pretty heavy. He carried it bent over the entire time, and my uncle still has that harmonica today. It was left to him when my grandpa died, and the other one he brought here was left with my mum, who gave it to me. So now that my grandparents had arrived, we can continue the story of my mum. When they arrived, my mum finally told them that she was pregnant. At that point, she was already 7 months along. Once my mum's pregnancy had become known after she told her parents, she moved to a different refuge house in Baden. This one was specifically for pregnant women or single mothers. There are about 10 women there. And that's where I was born, Baden, Switzerland. A few months after my birth, my mum was given a house to share with another single mother in Turkey, Switzerland. They had their own rooms, but they shared the living room and kitchen together. From there, we came to Australia. Getting here wasn't easy though. My mum had 2 weeks to sort everything out, and she didn't even have any money to buy tickets. She had to find someone to buy them for us, and eventually she did. Our visa expired on October the 2nd. We landed in Sydney on October the 2nd. So yeah, it was cut very close. We arrived in Sydney with a single suitcase of 25 kilos. Inside were some nappies, a dirty one included, a few books, photos, a pair of jeans, and a jumper. That jumper was the same green men's cashmere one that Stevo the thief had given to her. When he gave it to her as a parting gift, my mum thought, "I won't need this in Australia, it's too hot there." He said, "I don't have anything else to give you, so just take it, and the Zippo." But when we arrived, it's a good thing that she had that jumper because it was still cold and Australia wasn't as hot as she thought it would be. She ended up wearing that jumper for months. She also had a pair of red jeans that were given to her from my auntie's cousin that she wore for months too. We stayed with family in Sydney for a few weeks before moving to Perth, following my uncle who had arrived 2 weeks before us. My uncle had papers to come to Australia for a while, but they dragged it out until everyone started coming or planning to come to Australia. We all had our papers sent over from family that made it here before us somehow. However, in the meantime, my mum also had the opportunity to arrive with her friend Bula, who was in love with my mum. Bula left Sarajevo and made it to Zagreb. He called my mum one day and asked if she wants to apply to come to Australia as his fiancée. My mum said yes, but she doesn't want a relationship and told him don't get confused, but we can go as friends so we are not alone in a new country. So he agreed and he sent the application, but in the meantime my mum became pregnant with me. When the application was handed into the embassy, they sent my mum to do some tests. They saw she was pregnant, but he was in Croatia and my mum was in Switzerland, so things didn't add up. Everyone around him was getting approved applications, but not him after that. So my mum told the embassies that Bula didn't know and he didn't do anything wrong, so please let him into Australia. They didn't have to let her in, just don't hold him back as he's in a difficult position and he didn't know that she was pregnant. In the end, he managed to go to Australia and Mum showed them that she had other papers to prove that she had other options, but she didn't want to hurt him. So they let Bula go, but they held my mum until the very last minute so that she wouldn't know if she could go or not. They did that on purpose, of course. But here we are, we made it. A now family friend and friend of my uncle's, who also turns out to be the midwife that later delivered my daughter Luna, let us stay with her and her family when we first got to Perth. We stayed there until my mum got her bearings and was able to get a Homeswest apartment. After a few Homeswests, one in Northbridge and some other places, we settled in Subiaco. We lived there for a long while, but we also moved between there and Sydney quite often because my mum had a partner in Sydney who helped her grasp the way of living in Australia. My grandparents eventually made it to Perth a few weeks or months after us, and they stayed with my uncle in Dianella for a while before moving into a private place. And then later, they were able to get settled in Homeswest. My uncle played a major role in helping our family and many other families escape the war. He had connections that not everyone had. Whoever needed help, he helped them, and if my uncle hadn't left when he did, who knows what would have happened. We really do have him to thank for the fact that we all made it out safely. Before we dive into life in Australia, I want to share a story about my mum from her first year in Switzerland. It was her birthday and she thought my uncle had forgotten. He hadn't showed up or anything. She waited all day for him, but he didn't show up. He arrived late at night, and it turned out that he had to break into someone's car to steal a radio. He sold it to buy her flowers because he didn't have any money for a present or petrol. I've always loved that story. Now let's continue. When I was about 5, my mum met a man online, John, who would later become my stepfather. He was Australian and they couldn't really understand each other at first, but they made it work somehow and found ways to communicate. When I was about 6, he came back to Bosnia with us to see where we were from. That was the last time my mum has been back. The place was still war-torn and run down, and it brought back too many bad memories. She's not in a rush to return even now, although I have gone back a few times since, and my grandma goes back almost every year to see her sisters, but not since COVID. The last time I was in Bosnia I was 12, and I went to meet my father for the first time, where he stood me up. My father. That is all quite the dramatic story in its own. So to carry on my life in Perth, when I was around 8, my stepdad bought a house in Northbridge. We lived there with my mum and my brother, who was born in 2005, when I was almost 10 years old. My stepdad worked as a sort of engineer at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, and my mum was a relief teacher who also did a lot of art. My stepdad had such a healthy lifestyle. He barely drank, only on occasion he would. He also rode his bike to and from work every day, rain, hail and shine. Every morning he would also wake up and have a homemade healthy juice. We were always having exhibition parties at my mum's art exhibitions and travelling Australia. Life was great, life was normal. I had a great childhood. My family, traumatised by the war, when they came to Australia they had to do English school. It was compulsory. But my grandparents were so traumatised they couldn't concentrate on learning English. That was the last thing on their mind. So they never really learnt it well. And you can't blame them for that. When they were in class, they were not thinking about learning. My mum does have an accent, but she's pretty good at English. My brother even grew up not even noticing her accent. That's funny though, because she has a strong accent. Life was normal. I mean, I grew up, I went to school. I had problems making friends though, maybe because my English wasn't great. My cousin and I had the same challenges, as did many other kids in our position, I'm sure. When you think about it, our parents didn't know English. We only spoke Bosnian up until we started going to school. The teachers called my mum to school one time and they said that there's something wrong with your child. She's making gibberish in her creative writing. My mum said she's writing in Bosnian with a mix of English in there too, there's nothing wrong with her. I didn't know at the time, but they were all just words for me. I didn't know that not everyone understood. Those words were normal for me and I use them in my household daily. When we moved to Northbridge though, I moved from Subiaco to Highgate. I always wanted to be number one, but I was always number two. I had great grades, I had great friends at that time, and I enjoyed my childhood. But by the time I made it to high school, things started to change. At 14, I got hit by a car. If you want to hear psychic predictions, I predicted that would happen twice. Once through drawing art, where I drew a picture of a girl standing in the middle of the road with the ambulance behind her, and the girl looked like me as well. But I didn't put two and two together until after the accident, and I mean like a couple of years after the accident. And then also I posted on Facebook 2 weeks before it happened, posting as if it had already happened. I must say though, I have predicted many tragic events many times before, including people's times of death. My mum also predicted the car accident to an extent too. I think I'll have to do a whole episode on the hoodoo voodoo stuff because I know a lot of people can relate and I've got so many stories to share about it. And if people don't relate, they still find it interesting. But the way that my mum predicted it in this case was more of a warning from my great-grandmother, my grandpa's mum. She came to her in a dream, and at this point she had already passed on. In her dream, she warned her about one of her kids. My mum thought she was talking about my brother. My great-grandmother always comes to dreams to warn my mum. She doesn't speak though, it's just a feeling that she gets. My great-grandmother, grandpa's mother, was also able to predict events daily in her life. She would say things like be careful when she sensed something bad would happen. Every day she gave small predictions as if it were the Weather Channel. Anyway, I was hit by a car. I was walking across the road and a car had hit me going over 60 km an hour. When the car had hit me, witnesses say that my head went through the windshield, smashed the glass, and then I flew 30 meters over the car before I hit the ground. When I was laying on the ground, I felt like I could just get up and move. But when I tried to move, I physically couldn't move at all. Everything seemed so blurred. I couldn't see people's faces, but I could make out shadows around me. There was a group of people surrounding me from the real estate place across the road. I didn't know what had happened. I was asking them what had happened, but no one was answering me. I looked to the left and I see a bus making a detour. And then I was like, oh, I think I was hit by a car. I was so terrified about what my mum would think. I told the people around me to please tell her that I'm sorry. Before I came to though, I remember laying there and I almost had to decide whether I was going to make it or not. It felt like the decision was mine. When I got to hospital, I needed 3 bags of blood transfused into me. So I had lost a lot of blood. I had also snapped my femur straight in half, broken my arm or my shoulder. It's kind of like the ball in the socket that was broken. The socket had snapped in half. And of course your general scarring, plastic surgery, had stitches on my head and my nose. Pinky and my tendon had ripped and that still bothers me even to this day. So does my shoulder. The whole time I was so hyper focused on my mum and wanting to apologize to her for what I had put her through. I knew that she was going to be very upset. I didn't want to hurt her, but I had, by hurting myself. When I first saw my mum's face in the emergency room, I felt a relief, and I told her that I was so sorry, and she made me feel that everything was okay. The next 24 hours after that were the worst that I've ever experienced. Those 24 hours, I had to fast, and I didn't really have many strong painkillers. They had to put pins and poles in my femur to straighten it up. That was the part where they had to fix me. And then other thoughts started flooding through my brain. Wait a minute, I could see my leg hanging up there. It was swollen, it was purple, it was huge. And I was like, do they have to amputate my leg? Am I going to be able to walk again? What's wrong with me? This is when I started to question the actual physical aspects of myself. Once I was okay, after I saw my mum, that was the next thing. So I was in hospital for 2 weeks, but I was unable to do anything for myself for many months after that. I didn't go to school for about 2 years, really. I missed so much of school that I missed out on social experiences, and I lost a lot of friends through that too. If this is something that you want to hear about more and go into more depth, I'm happy to talk about it. But for now, I'm just going to focus on getting through the rest of this, because obviously, how do you put almost 30 years of life into 1 hour? So let's keep going. I finally made a full recovery after my last operation at 16 years old. I think it was about a year or so after my initial operation, or maybe it was a couple months, because I was still technically growing a little bit, my bone wasn't healing properly. So they had to remove one of the screws in my leg. But as they removed it, it snapped. So they just left it in there. And I had half a screw in my leg for a while. Every time I'd walk upstairs, I could feel it crunching. And I can still feel it to this day. It's like a ghost screw. But when I was 16, I had the choice to remove the screw. And then they asked me, do I want to remove everything else? Because it doesn't really have to stay there. And I was like, yeah, just remove it all. So everything has been removed. And I am thankful for that. Carrying on from my car accident though, one day it was a gloomy day. It was overcast and I was in the bedroom. At the time my brother was young and he slept in the bedroom with my mum, and my stepdad slept in my brother's room. Suddenly crows started tapping on the window, and then I got this wave of energy, a very, very clear, strong feeling, and an instant thought, someone in this house is going to die. 2 weeks after the prediction in my mind, my stepdad was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. I have since started writing down my predictions when I get them with the evidence of the date so that I don't sound crazy. Towards the end of my stepdad's life, I was on Australia's Next Top Model. I was selected to be in the show, and I was 1 out of 7 people selected out of Perth from the 4,000 people who tried out. So that's a pretty big accomplishment for me. I was also Miss Universe, and I grew up doing a lot of modelling. However, at some stage in my later years, probably about 19, I just stopped. I stopped because I tried to get in a couple of agencies, but I couldn't because I was too fat to be a model. So I went home and I ordered pizza because I was like, you can't tell me that I'm fat. I was only on Australia's Next Top Model for 1 episode, and I hid from the cameras because I was shy, and also I was going through the death of my stepdad. I applied to do it because my cousin told me I should give it a go. So I went in there and I had no expectations, and I didn't really care if I got through or not. On the audition day though, I felt very aligned to the universe. When I came back to Perth, I only saw my stepdad maybe 2 more times before he died. It was very sad because my brother was so young. He was about 6 or 7. Funny that the age that John, my stepdad, came into my life was the age that he left my brother's life. He adored my brother so much. There wasn't a stronger love that I have seen. When he had my brother, his dreams and his life purpose seemed to be complete. They were at the library every day together. He played with him every day. Maybe that's why my brother's so smart. I am very proud of my brother. He's only 19 and one of the top students in Curtin University. Through high school, he didn't even give it 100%, and he was always a top student there too. But ask him to draw a stick man. I don't know if he could. He is different to me entirely. He has so much discipline that at the age of 14, he was exercising daily and on a strict diet regime, maybe too strict. But I ended up forcing him to have a taste of my milkshake and also to go get froyo with me. That was before the Yogi days. And that kind of settled the extremity of his diet. He was still very consistent, but he relaxed a little bit, which is what he needed to do, I'd say. So back to me. After some traveling around Europe before COVID, I met my partner Brenton. Well, actually, we had already met as friends when I was 19, but we rekindled when I was about 21, 22. Brendan has 2 kids, and that makes me a stepmother. I must say, stepping into that role isn't easy, but I was lucky that his kids were absolutely amazing and they loved me straight away. It was tricky because I hadn't been around kids apart from my brother and his friends, and that was as a sibling with a closer age gap and a long time ago at that point. I never did my own washing, cooking, or anything. I lived with my mum and she just did it for me. I started dating Brenton, who was 10 years older than me, a single father, and I was forced to grow up. Single dads are great. They cook, they clean, they work. I do stand by single dads. After seeing my partner's situation and many other unfortunate circumstances of men, especially the good ones, the system is unfair sometimes. Of course, these things are in place for a reason, don't get me wrong, because there are many circumstances where people are not so great. But so many men are amazing fathers, and so many of them commit suicide just from the pressures of divorce and the single dad system. I just don't like injustice. Anyway, for the first year of our relationship, I was sick the whole time because his kids were always sick and they carried sicknesses. Nobody else really got affected to these sicknesses drastically apart from me because I just wasn't immune to them. I wasn't used to having kids and getting sick all the time. That whole year, I'm telling you, I was sick. And the other tricky part was I also love personal space, and I didn't get any of that because I was so loved. I was just a bit smothered. But can you really complain about something like that? It was hard, but we made it work with no effort. And we still do. I found my person, and that's a fact, and that won't change. Later down the track, I ended up coming to some cash and buying a house outright, making sure there was enough space for all of us, plus one more in the future. Then if there were going to be more later, we could reassess. We had tried to have a baby for a while. I think it was about 3 years or so, but nothing. So when we moved into the new house, we started to seek fertility help. They sent us to do some tests and quickly started treatment. I had suspected endometriosis, and I had PCOS diagnosed at the age of 14 and then again later on in my adult life. So we thought I was the problem. Brenton had already had 2 kids, so it couldn't have been him. The night before our appointment at Concept Fertility, Brenton said, "How funny would it be if I was the problem the whole time?" We laughed and thought it was hilarious. Anyway, when we went the next day, the doctor planned our treatment, and at the end Brenton asked, just out of curiosity, "What's my count?" She does a look and she says, oh. And then she started to panic. I mean, the doctor really should have checked first, especially in her field. I would have thought that would be more common. Let me tell you, a count of 15 million is assumed infertile. Brenton had 800,000 and mutated too. The cause, we still don't know. But after going to the best fertility naturopath in Perth, she did all the tests and scans possible. His hormones were fine and working correctly. There were no blockages. We are yet to take it to the next step. But from what we know, there's nothing specific determining it. After Brenton stopped drinking and vaping, the quality improved and it jumped to a max of 2 million. But that is still extremely low. It is very strange. Continuing on, the plan changed. We were not only doing IVF, but something called ICSI, where they picked the best one out by eye. We ended up having 1 embryo and using it. It was a failed pregnancy. At 13 weeks, we lost what would have been a boy. This is when we started to see the naturopath. She set our bodies up the best that she could in 3 months to give it the best go, and referred us to a fertility specialist that she believed was good. So we changed IVF clinics, and after 3 months or so, we started a new fertility cycle. It was just as quick as we hoped. We went in for the appointment, and 3 days later, the cycle started. This was only possible because of the naturopath who had done all the tests that we needed for the doctor beforehand. So we came in very prepared. All our tests were done, so we could just jump straight into it. This round was a little different though. It was called Pixie, and the difference was that instead of picking by eye the best one, a chemical is used to attract the best ones for a better chance. So now we have 2 in the freezer, and the embryo we used is now Luna. We are always open about our IVF journey, and it is much more common than people realize. But from there, I became a mother, and motherhood is a whole different topic on its own. I was going to call my baby Luna Emida, after my family member, and also because my mum's first name was Emida before my grandpa changed it when he came back from wherever he was. I think it was in the army when my mum was born. My grandma didn't name her either. She didn't care too much for the name. She was just in awe of my mum's birth. But my grandpa's mother and his mother's sister were arguing over whose name she should have. They ended up naming her after my great-grandmother's sister, who had a hard life. When my grandpa came back, he was furious and changed her name to Yasna. I love the name Emina, and I changed it to Luna because I didn't want her to have a hard life. Really, it's just a superstition. Or maybe it's not, who's to know for sure. Considering everything that my family had endured, they've come out pretty normal. But trauma lingers in small ways. My mother, for example, has a short fuse, and now you understand why. It also goes to show that there are still so many racial stereotypes, especially when it comes to refugees, or really anything. I hope this episode helps challenge some of those social norms and remind people that refugees are all around us. They don't just fit into one single category. At the end of the day, we're all just people, and we shouldn't be so quick to judge. Because I can guarantee you, when you do, you're probably getting it all wrong anyway. And that's a wrap for today's episode. I know we've covered a lot, but I hope you found a little piece of our journey meaningful and maybe even relatable. The story of our escape from the war, the challenges, the sacrifices along the way, and everything that followed has shaped who I am today. It's a story of survival, resilience, and a family that somehow, despite everything, found its way to safety and new beginnings in a Western world. As I reflect on all of this, I think about the power of the human spirit to overcome and adapt absolutely everything. I know that no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, there's so much strength in all of us. And For anyone out there who might feel like their story doesn't matter or they don't belong, I want to remind you, you do. We all have a story worth telling. You may see your life as boring, because I did for so many years, but that's because it's yours and it's what you're used to. To other people with different lives, you are so interesting. So share your story. If you have any questions, thoughts, or even want me to dive deeper into certain topics that we touched on, please send me a message. I'll be happy to do so. I love hearing from you all, and your feedback truly helps me shape this podcast. Don't forget to share, comment, and show your support if you enjoyed the episode. And please, if you're able to, take a moment to reflect on the people around you, their backgrounds, their stories. Sometimes there's so much more beneath the surface that meets the eye. Ask them deeper questions this week. Until next time, keep an open mind, stay curious, and be kind to yourself and others. And as always, don't forget to tune in to Your Safe Friday. Thanks again for being here, and take care.